Hello and welcome. This is Mouse Gunner, and we're back with some more Automation, the car company tycoon game. Continuing on with the campaign roleplay of the Edison car company in 2002. And the model we're going to look at in this video is the Edison Asteroid, which is the pickup truck in the car company's lineup. So we're going to start off with the base trim. Now I did some things that are quite a bit different than what I did in the last year period as far as the trim setup for this model. But let's start off from the beginning with the body. And we have 6 overall trims to look at. So this is probably going to be a little bit longer video than my first 2 videos covering the Luna and Star, but probably comparable to what we saw with the Constellation. So in any case, the body I chose is the only body that is the pickup truck that is available to me in this year period. But we don't really have any penalties as a result of that. As you can see, there's no message here saying I have a penalty. But as far as the chassis goes, I have a ladder chassis made out of 8HS steel. We have front longitudinal engine placement, McPherson strut in the front, and solid I-axle leaf in the rear. And the main thing we're concerning ourselves with is that load capacity. So we have extremely high here, and we have average here, but that's better than the low that we get with the double wishbone suspension. And the panel material is corrosion-resistant steel. As far as the styling, keeping things pretty simple. There we go. And the setup for this is a longitudinal rear-wheel drive, at least for this standard trim. And this is the 2-door variant with the longer bed. Now, the engine we're going to be using is the Asteroid's variant of the V6, which is a aluminum silicone block and head. Bore and stroke equal out to 3.6 liters of displacement. And this is a single overhead cam with 3 valves per cylinder. Now, this is very similar and also has VVL. It's very similar to the Constellation engine. It's mostly just a tweaking of that engine. So there's going to be a lot of similarities here. So we have cast iron crank, I-beam steel forged pistons. Compression comes in at 9.4, cam profile at 36, and VVL profile at 57. Naturally aspirated. Oh, and this also has VVT. Naturally aspirated. This has a multi-point fuel injection, electronic fuel injection, but only single throttle rather than twin throttle, as we saw with the Constellation. And this uses regular rather than premium fuel, again, as we saw in the Constellation. Fuel mixture is 14.9, and ignition timing is 32, with an RPM limit of 7,100. This has short cast headers. It's only a single exhaust versus the dual exhaust we saw with the Constellation, and we have 3-way cat with only 1 reverse flow muffler. The end result of that is we have 227 horsepower and 208 foot-pounds of torque. So moving on to the trim setup. We have an automatic transmission. I don't have any manual transmission versions of this model anymore, and I did this for a large part to allow me to have more overall trims in other areas. In any case, 4-speed automatic, not the 5-speed automatic we saw with the Constellation, so we're not using that higher tech that we saw with the Constellation. And the end result of the way that I set it up is I have that 4th gear go a little bit beyond the estimated top speed. And some of that is to reduce the wheel spin we're seeing. We have a little under 20% wheel spin, 19%. Now, you're going to expect higher numbers with a pickup truck because you don't have a lot of weight in the back. And usually speaking, pickup trucks are designed around the fact that you're going to have a load in the back. So it's going to handle at its best with weight in the rear that we're not seeing here because we don't have a load. So as a result, we have quite a bit of wheel spin. We end up with a 0 to 62 time of 7.9 seconds and a fuel economy of 15.5 miles per gallon. This does use a manual locker differential, and this is to help with off-roadability. Although not every trim is going to use that setup. We have hard long life road, which I discovered in my previous year period design of the Asteroid, is going to help us in a number of areas, for instance, off-roadability. So if we switch to medium compound road, you note that we lost quite a bit of off-road ability. So hard, long life road give you a number of advantages. Of course, one disadvantage that you get is a lot more wheel spin. As a matter of fact, a significant amount. Matter of fact, I'm kind of curious. Why did it jump to 19.3%? Maybe we just need to recalculate that. All right, for some reason we're getting 19.3% wheel spin rather than the 19% we were getting before. Don't ask me why. Sometimes this game, when you just do slight changes, it recalculates everything and you get completely different numbers. And I don't know what changed there outside of me just changing that back and forth. Oh well. In any case, this is the tire and wheel setup that I ended up with. So I have 225s in the front and 245s in the rear, and 17-inch rims with steel rim material. And I do have a little bit of rim offset just to fill out the body. All right, moving along, we have the brakes. We have solid disc in the front, 2-piston, and drums in the rear. Brakes as large as they can be. And we have a little tiny bit of brake fade in this trim. Cooling airflow. We have an off-road skid tray, again, maximizing the off-road ability of the vehicle. And cooling airflow, we're going with 20 above the required cooling, which is double what I normally would do. And that's just to aid with a little bit more ruggedness for the Asteroid. As far as the interior goes, this is where we have a little bit of divergence with what I did in the previous year period. So in the previous year period, I had what I called work trucks, which used more basic interiors and basic entertainment. I've done away with that. Instead, I just have a standard overall trim that is going to use standard interior, standard entertainment. I still have 2 seats up front, though, as I am considering this thing to have a console and a center console that is only going to allow for 2 passengers. I have power steering and ABS as standard, as well as standard safety. The suspension setup, I have progressive springs, which is, I think, typically what you see with a pickup truck, gas monotube dampers, and passive sway bars. This is the suspension setup that I went with. And let's go ahead and jump straight into the test track. So we have a top speed of 114.8 miles an hour. We have 3,200 pounds overall, and weight distribution is definitely on the front heavy side, which again we expect because there's not a whole lot of weight in the rear. Let's go ahead and get our track time. And we get a time of 1 minute 36.99, so might as well be 1 minute 37. All right, let's jump into the next trim, which is going to be the standard V8. Now this is going to use the same body as the previous trim that we looked at, and more or less similar setup, although we do have a more powerful engine. So as a result, we get a quicker 0 to 62 time and worse fuel economy. But we also get paired with that a lot more wheel spin. And I haven't really done anything to really tame that wheel spin, although I could have. And to do that, I probably would end up with very comparable 0 to 62 time that we got with the V6. So in my opinion, not really something that we should be looking into. Again, you just have to keep in mind that in a real pickup truck, if you had a load in the back, a lot of this would not be as bad as what we're seeing. But again, we still have a manual locker. We still have hard, long life road tires. I'm curious if we're going to have the same thing that we saw before. So we only have a slight reduction in wheel spin with that medium compound tires, which is more what I expect to see. And I'm not sure if that's that big of a change. You guys can tell a little bit easier than I can by switching back and forth in the video to see if we had that same issue that we saw before. Also, you'll note a big difference in drivability stats, for instance. Otherwise, the tire setup is more or less the same. The brake setup is going to be more or less the same as well, but we're going to have more brake fade because we're going to achieve higher top speeds, and we're going to have more weight that we're going to have to contend with for those brakes. The under tray is still off-road skid tray, but now we require more cooling airflow because of the V8, so we bumped that up. Otherwise, this is more or less the same. Suspension, there's probably going to be some slight differences because of the difference in weight. Jumping into the test track, we can see that now we are at a top speed of 125.1 miles an hour. We added on a couple 100 pounds, and we're more front heavy as a result. Although we are quicker 0 to 62 time. I do expect a quicker track time, but it might not be that much quicker. Alright, so the overall difference in time is 1 minute 34.07. So it is actually quite a bit different. Actually, almost 3 seconds of difference. So I guess I was wrong in that regard. Alright, let's go ahead and jump into the last of the standard trims, which is going to have the addition of all-wheel drive. Now, in the previous year period, I used 4x4. But as years progress, there's going to be more of a switch in pickup trucks from 4x4 over to all-wheel drive, and that's definitely a switch that we have gone to in this year period. So just showing it very quickly. And I just remembered I did not show you the V8, so I might as well do that as while I'm at it. So we have longitudinal all-wheel drive as opposed to longitudinal rear-wheel drive that we had before. And let's go ahead and show the engine, as I failed to do that previously. So we have, again, an aluminum silicone block and head V8 with a 5-liter displacement. Again, this is going to be very similar to the Constellation variant of this engine. So single overhead cam with 3 valves per cylinder, cast iron crank, I-beam steel conrods, and forged pistons. Compression comes in at 9.2, cam profile at 34, and VVL at 53. Naturally aspirated. This is multi-point EFI with twin throttle setup. I probably should have switched that to single throttle setup. But I'm just going to keep it that way for now so I don't mess up all of my design. But that's a change I should have made and obviously overlooked. But in any case, moving along, standard intake, regular fuel mixture comes in at 14.9, ignition timing at 40, and RPM limit at 6,900. Exhaust, this is short cast, single exhaust, with a 3-way cat and a single reverse flow muffler. And performance is 303 horsepower and 292 foot-pounds of torque. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into the gearbox setup. So this is a 4-speed automatic as we saw previously, but now because of the all-wheel drive, we do have a difference in power distribution. So we do have some wheel spin, but it's not nearly as bad as what we saw with the other V8-powered version. And as a result, we also get a better 0 to 62 time because I'm able to be a little bit more aggressive with the gearbox. So it comes to 6.9 seconds. And we also probably have more grip as well, because we have more traction overall. The tire setup is going to be more or less the same, as are the brakes, although we do see a little bit more brake fade here. Cooling airflow should be the same. Interior is the same. And suspension might be slightly different because of the difference in weight, which we will be taking a look at now. So top speed has gone down to 122.3 miles an hour. We have 3,500 plus pounds. Weight distribution is still front heavy. Now we do have a quicker 0 to 62 time, but just as we saw with the Constellation, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will be overall faster around the track. So let's go ahead and see if we are indeed faster or slower. Alright, so as we can see, we are indeed slower. As I said, just because you have a faster 0 to 62 time doesn't necessarily mean that you will be quicker. A lot of times it does mean that, but when you're heavier and you have a slower top speed, which is going to have an effect on the overall time because once you hit that top speed, you obviously can't go any faster than that. But also that weight that we have is going to affect cornering. So I think that's a lot of the reason why you oftentimes have worse performance with the all-wheel drive vehicles, even though you have a faster 0 to 62 time, which usually translates into a faster overall time. Jumping into the first crew cab trim, which there are 3 of, all of which have the V8, none of which have the V6. And I did remember to actually change the styling of the crew cab this time around, so I actually have 2 separate door handles, one for the rear door and one for the front doors. Otherwise, the styling is more or less the same outside of the addition of that crew cab. So moving along, let's first start with the gearbox setup, which is going to be the same 4-speed automatic that we used before, although it's going to be set up maybe slightly differently. So overall, we get a 0 to 62 time of 7 seconds, and wheel spin comes in at 18.7%. Now, I do have one addition here with all the crew cab variants. Rather than have the manual locker, I've actually switched to a viscous LSD, which is going to give us a little bit better overall traction. I mean, let's just switch between the two so you can see. So we have a lot more wheel spin here and slower 0 to 62 time as a result of that not so great traction. But with the viscous LSD, we get a little bit better traction, so we improve that 0 to 62 time. Moving along, we have the tire setup, which is going to be the same as what we've seen in the past, as is the brake setup. So we have a little bit more brake fade than we've seen before, but that's because we have more weight. Although the distribution of that weight is going to be a little bit different as well. We still have an off-road skid tray, and I did toy with the idea of doing a fully clad under tray, but I ended up going with the off-road skid tray because I wanted this to still have some off-road ability to it, and cooling airflow is going to be roughly about the same. Interior-wise, we still have a standard interior here overall. Suspension might be slightly different, but overall, it's more or less the same as what we have had in the past. And let's go ahead and jump right into the test track so we can see the weight that we get. So we have almost 3,600 pounds. Top speed comes in at 125.4 miles per hour. But you do see with the weight distribution, it's not quite as front heavy as the other V8 versions. So let's go ahead and take a look at the track time. Now this is going to be a comparison with the all-wheel drive version of the standard cab that we saw previously. And we can see that this is performing better than that. And I would say pretty close probably to the standard cab performance, although maybe slightly worse. I'm not exactly sure. Maybe slightly better because we have a bit better 0 to 62 time. It's I'm not 100% on that. As a matter of fact, we can do a direct comparison if you would just to see. So let's just grab the standard V8. There we go. Just do a quick time here. Of course, I say quick, and then it takes a while to load in. There we go. So actually, yeah, it is slightly better, and I think a lot of that is due to the worse 0 to 62 time that we see. Okay, let's now jump into the next crew cab variant, which is the standard crew cab, but with all-wheel drive. So here we see actually a worse 0 to 62 time, and that could be because I didn't really do much with the gearbox. I could have made it more aggressive to make them equal, but I don't think I did that and in the end. But we still do have wheel spin, even with the all-wheel drive here, just not as bad. So even with the addition of viscous LSD and all-wheel drive, we still have some wheel spin, which is interesting. Tire setup is the same as we saw before. Brake setup is the same, so we have still more brake fade going on because of increase in weight. Cooling airflow is the same. Interior is the same, as is, well, maybe some slight differences with the suspension. Let's now look at the test track here. So we got a top speed of 122.6 miles an hour, a slower 0 to 62 time. So let's just face facts. This is heavier, this is going to be slower. There's no way that this is going to be any faster. This is definitely going to be slower. Let's stop that, and we see we are indeed slower. So we've got 1 minute 35.2, which is slower than the all-wheel drive standard trim, the standard cab trim of that. So definitely that increased weight did affect this. Of course, I could go more aggressive with the gearbox and maybe diminish some of those losses, but I obviously didn't do that. In any case, moving on to the last of the crew cab versions is the premium trim. Now, this is still all-wheel drive. I just lopped off the all-wheel drive adder onto the name just because there is only one premium version, so there's no reason to differentiate. But just in case you thought I was lying, let's just check that out real quick. There you go, longitudinal all-wheel drive. And to switch to the crew cab, all you have to do is just click on this variation of the body. So you have the 2-door standard cab here, and then you have the 4-door crew cab here. Okay, moving on. So first, let's start with the gearbox. So 0 to 62 time has gone down still more, and again, I could have gone more aggressively, and I'm actually surprised I didn't go more aggressive. As a matter of fact, I think I'm going to make that change right now. There you go. So we went a little bit more aggressive here, but to bring that 0 to 62 time down, and we get, better results across the board of doing that. So maybe that's something I should have done with the other all-wheel drive crew cab version, has gone more aggressive to bring that 0 to 62 time closer to what it was with the non-all-wheel drive, the rear-wheel drive version. And I could, of course, do that even more so with this trim. But as you can see, we have 3.9% as our wheel spin, and we have a 0 to 62 time of 7.1. Moving along, tire setup is the same. Brake setup is the same, but again, we have more brake fade because of increase in weight. The airflow setup or aerodynamics is the same, but this is where we have a little bit of divergence. So we have a premium interior, premium entertainment, the addition of traction control and electronic stability control as well. Suspension might be, again, slightly different because of the difference in weight. Let's now jump into our test track. So we're now going 123.1 miles an hour for our top speed. Weight is at a little over 3,800 pounds. And weight distribution is, it's still front heavy, but not quite as bad as it was with the standard cab version. I don't think, in any case. Do a track time. And this is the time that we get. So still slower. So we have 1 minute 35.68. And I think, that makes perfect sense considering that we have more weight on here, that we're getting that slightly slower time. All right, let's now take a look at the project setup. So as opposed to the Constellation where we had more of an emphasis on design, this has more of an emphasis on production. So we're more efficient with the setup here of the focus of the overall design of this vehicle as well as the engine. Again, this is the same engine you see in the Constellation, so this difference in focus for the same engine might be a little odd, but in any case, moving on to the actual factory setup. So I have a huge factory here, and again, I have to do that because how many trims I have. And then we have the setup of those factories. So I went with a 80 automation, and I only went with 2 shifts. And the main reason I did this, rather than crank out as much as I could, is because I couldn't keep up with engine production. I could produce way more actual car bodies than I could engines. So because of that, I actually ended up lowering the shifts down to 2. So we can see here with the engine, I am using a huge factory, which is maximizing how many engines I can produce. But even with the shifts cranking out as much as I cannot produce enough V8s to also crank out as many bodies as I can. So I had to limit those to match them up. Otherwise, the automation is pretty much the same setup. And V6 wise, I don't think I had to go quite to that extent. So I ended up using a large factory here. And shifts are actually reduced because there's only one trim that uses V6s. All the other trims use V8s. Now, I figured that the 2 most sold versions would be the 2 standard trims, and more specifically, the V8 all-wheel drive trim would be the most sold. Because I figured that these would be the ones that are sold the most as work trucks. So that's the reason why I have the higher production numbers here. But I also considered as far as, what would be the most popular of the crew cab. And I figured with the crew cab, you're spending a little bit more. So I might as well go more heavy on the all-wheel drive version because I think that would be the more desirable of the different crew cab variants. So I went with more production numbers here. But the standard cabs are the ones that I have the highest overall production in. But as far as the engine production goes, I only need to match those production numbers. So to do that, I ended up having to lower the shifts here and dramatically increase them here. All right, let's jump into the market performance for the Asteroid, starting off with the base trim, which is the V6 powered standard cab trim, which comes in at a little under $17,000 with a 5% markup, which is my standard markup that I use for all of the models for consistency's sake. And the market segments we do the best in is utility sport, off-road premium, and heavy utility. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, without making it too much of a rant, is that this market performance part of the game is the one part of the game that I think needs the most adjustment. And the big thing that I think needs adjusting is this affordability numbers, especially for some of the market segments. I just don't think that they're all that realistic. When you consider the price of a normal pickup truck, usually pickup trucks are going to cost more than a lot of other vehicles. And the affordability of a lot of the market segments you would think a pickup truck would do well in and how low they are. You get this in other market segments as well. For instance, some sports car segments have very low affordability numbers, even though they're performance cars, which you think would cost more. But this is one of the ones that is affected the most. And even with the cheapest trim we're going to be looking at, we have dramatically low affordability and some of the market segments that we're really aiming to do well in. For instance, delivery and utility segments are one of the ones that we're definitely trying to do well in. But yet our affordability is so low, it also drives down our competitiveness. Just to demonstrate that really quickly here. So bringing down that markup, just 1%, changes the affordability by 0.4%. But look at the difference it's had in our competitiveness. So I'm going to bring it back up. You'll see a full point of difference in that market segment for just a 0.4% change in affordability. So pretty dramatic impact. So as our affordability goes down as we go through the more expensive trims, you'll see that competitiveness also lower, although we would expect our future trims to technically do better because they overall perform better than our standard base trim. So let's jump into our V8 and see that in practice. So we see here, we're still doing well in utility sport, off-road premium, and heavy utility. And I will point out we're doing well in these segments because our affordability is so high. But you'll note that the delivery segment is no longer as bright of a green as it used to be. And it's no longer giving us the numbers like it's giving us, for instance, heavy delivery as it did before. Now we can hover over it to get those numbers with the tooltip. And you'll see that affordability has indeed dropped because our price has gone up. So affordability has dropped, and see how much of an impact it has had on our competitiveness. A trim that possibly would have given us more competitiveness if affordability was taken out of the equation. So definitely we are being hampered by that effect, but let's just focus on, from here on out, just what we end up getting here. So jumping into the next trim, which would be the standard cab with all-wheel drive. We now are no longer doing as well on the heavy utility, and of course that's because affordability has continued to drop because our price continues to go up. But we're still doing well in utility sport, off-road premium, and utility premium. Now you'll note that our affordability has been dropping, but yet we're actually getting better numbers in some of these categories, and that's because of an increase in overall stat performance of the trim. That is more or less negating the drop in affordability that we've had. But that's not always going to be the case. All right, let's now jump into our base crew cab trim, which we're going to have an increase in cost as we go along here. So now utility sport, off-road premium, and family utility premium are going to be the three market segments we do the best in. And again, that's because the affordability of those market segments are, not as bad. You will note that because our price has gone up, but we've lost the all-wheel drive element of the trim, that our performance has dropped very significantly from the all-wheel drive standard cab trim that we had previously. So let's see if we can regain that with our standard crew cab with the all-wheel drive. Keeping in mind that affordability is going to continue to go down. And we'll see, yeah, that affordability went down, and our overall competitiveness did go up from the rear-wheel drive trim, but it's not nearly as good as it was with the standard cab version because it was cheaper. But again, we're doing well on those three market segments that we were doing well in before. And we're doing well in the muscle car segment, as I said before. No matter what we build, it seems like we do well in either the pony segment or the muscle car segment. Let's now jump into the last trim, which is the premium crew cab, which is the most expensive trim that we have. And we can see that our affordability's gone up, but we have managed to bring that competitiveness up, though, because of some of the advantages of that premium trim. But again, we're doing well in these three market segments. And all right, pretty decent in utility premium. But again, that's because affordability is not too bad with that trim. But if we go to light delivery or delivery, you'll see that our affordability is, 23.3%. So our competitiveness is rock bottom. All right, so let's now take a look at the Asteroid, comparing it directly to the previous year's Asteroid, as well as the Constellation, which is this year period. So mostly we're just going to look at the comparison here. So we have a pretty marked difference in drivability. And that's one thing that I really tried to achieve with all of the models of this year period, is just get a little bit better drivability than we did in the past. As far as sportiness goes, I would say slight improvements for the most part. You have to ignore the manual transmission trim here that we had in the previous year period, because we don't have a manual transmission this year period, and you do get a bonus to sportiness because of that. Comfort is a definite increase here for the most part, as our worst trim is matching one of the best trims here. So definite improvement in comfort. Prestige is also a big improvement over the previous year period from what I can see. Then we have safety, which again appears to be an improvement. Practicality appears to be a slight improvement. So mostly the crew cab versions are the ones that are doing the best for both year periods, but overall it seems like a slight improvement. Now, off-road ability, I think we're going to have a slight dip, and it does appear, it depends. We have some that perform better than what we have here, but we have others that perform worse. For instance, our worst one is 33, and their worst one is 32. So it looks like in some areas we improved, in other areas we dropped off a little bit. We have utility, a little bit of a drop-off, I would say, for the most part, because our best performer is 72, but two trims in the past got that same number. And our worst is equaling, again, it's hard to say, but I would say there's more trims that perform better in utility from the previous year period than in the current year period. But it's like up and down, depending. Reliability, I would say, is another hit that we have. And I would say it's slight. If you remove the manual transmission and just compare automatic transmission variants, I would say it's a slight dip, with our worst one being here. Which is our premium one, so I think that makes sense that we have a little bit worse reliability in that regard. Fuel economy, we have a slight increase, again, ignoring the manual transmission, which is another thing that you're pretty much going to see, I think, across the board with this year period. Some of it is due to better tech that you get over time. We have an increase in weight, but a drop in emissions, increase in overall production units, and also increase in price. And I think we've seen that pretty much across the board for this year period specifically. Now, comparing the Constellation here, the Constellation is one of the strongest performers in drivability, sportiness, and comfort that we have thus far, as well as prestige, and safety. So pretty much this category, the Constellation is currently owning as far as all of the trims we've looked at so far. But practicality, it depends. It depends on which cab you have, either the crew cab or the standard cab. Standard cab is below the Constellation. Crew cab is above the Constellation. So it depends on which one you're talking about. And I think the crew cab is probably the more direct competitor to the Constellation. So I think that's good to see. As far as off-road ability, it doesn't, it's not too surprising that we're doing better in the Asteroid here, as it's built more for that. Utility, definitely also. It's no surprise that we're doing well in this. And this is probably going to be the strongest performer out of all the models we have. Looking at the Nebula would be a nice comparison for 2002 to see how the Nebula performs. But I haven't yet shown you that model, so I'm not going to be showcasing the difference here yet. Fuel economy, I'm going to expect this is going to be the worst out of all the models that we have for this year period. Weight is reduced, which is something that we saw in the previous year period comparing the two models together. Emissions looks like it's slightly worse as well. But production unit and overall cost is going to be lower than the Constellation, which, again, I think we expect. In any case, I think that wraps up the video. I hope you guys have enjoyed. This is Mouse Gunner, signing out.